Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I readily admit this is a friend of a friend story, but it had me kind of unsettled nonetheless. A guy who worked with a buddy of mine was talking about when he was younger, like 12, early teens, growing up in southern Ontario. He and his friend fancied themselves pretty hardcore, so they got on their bikes with baseball bats and went off to run around in the fields and try to look tough. They got to the edge of one and went into the forest beside it to climb trees and stuff, but when they got in a bit they saw this clearing with a little stick mound thing. It was a dome. Didn't look very big from the outside, but inside the ground had been dug out enough that it was tall enough to stand in. The only thing they found near the hut suggesting someone had been frequenting it was an animal skull that had been cleaved in half. The two of them were getting pretty edgy, so they decided to leave, but when they got back to the field they could see something rustling around in the grass. It stopped, and made a beeline straight for them. The guy telling the story said he freaked out and just started swinging as hard as he could until he connected with something and got sprayed with blood. The two of them took off without even stopping to see what they'd hit. I think the most unsettling thing about that story is that if it's true, he quite possibly killed some kind of hobo.
I hate you, X, for having these stories when I need to be awake in 4 hours. Oh well, I've got a story from my tour in Iraq. To preface it a little bit, I'm a 22-year-old male, 11B infantry, based out of Fort Lewis, 5/20ths INF. I saw some disturbing, non-paranormal, mental scar leaving shit during my tour. So we were based out of FOB Warhorse near the city of Baquba. We were about 3 days into Operation Arrowhead Ripper, and I was the platoon's radio telephone operator, RTO. For the past few months, we'd been living in the city for days at a time to hold the ground. Instead of going back to the FOB, we'd holed up in some random Haji house just like any other night. We were lucky enough to find a house with power and a TV that wasn't destroyed. We'd watched some that night and gradually drifted off to sleep. I woke up for my 0100 guard shift at the door with the radio. I'd been sitting there for about 15 minutes when the TV clicked on. Nothing but static. I didn't think much of it because it was satellite, no cable or real network stations in Iraq to my knowledge. I ignored it for a while until I started hearing someone speaking Arabic. I turned to look at the television and saw the outline of what looked like a 10-year-old boy. I thought I was hallucinating a bit, having been running on 36 hours of continuous operations before this. It was at that point I started catching bits and pieces of what was coming from the TV. The words I picked out were holes, courtyard, and bodies, all in Arabic. It was 3 to 4 sentences repeated, but that was all I could understand. Thinking this was a bad hallucination and fairly creeped out, I told the outline that we'd look into it in the morning. The outline nodded, and the television shut off. I glanced at my watch and noticed it was almost 0200. I woke up my relief and didn't mention the incident to him. The next morning, as we were getting ready to move out, I wandered around the courtyard, trying to find hollow spots. I found 2. I mentioned this to the platoon leader. He had me call higher and tell them we would be delayed that morning to check them out. We started in on them with sledgehammers and hooligan tools. Within an hour, the first one was opened up. We found 5 AK-47s, 20 loaded AK mags, an RPG-7 tube and 3 rounds for it. Not too long after that, the second hole was breached. We found a decomposing family in there. Father who appeared to have been about 35, mother who appeared to have been about 30, and a male child who appeared to have been age 8 to 10. All 3 had been shot in the forehead, execution style. Never told anyone in my unit about the kid in the static. I spent the first half of the tour working in Operations S3. As an RTO, our battalion was at FOB Loyalty for a week doing clearing operations in one neighborhood or another during Christmas of '06. There wasn't a lot of room on this FOB, so they put 10 of us on the 6th floor of one of the buildings. To get to where we stayed, you had to go up 3 flights of stairs in the living area, go through a locked door, then up another 3 flights of stairs. The trick was this. Floors 4 and 5 had previously been bombed out. No major structural damage, the building wasn't gonna collapse, but there were some damn big holes and a lot of rubble. Floor 6 had an observation point that could see over most of southern Baghdad. It was used during the initial invasion as a Special Forces, Delta Force sniper overwatch position. This sounds cool until you're told that the guys who were using it, the best of the best, were sniped themselves. Oh, yeah, did we forget to tell you? This was one of Saddam's torture palaces in Baghdad. We didn't find that last one out until we were packing up to leave. I didn't have it as bad as the other guys during that little operation. I worked night shift in the TOC, Tactical Operations Center, and slept during the day. All I ever had to deal with was the feeling of being watched. The guys on day shift? They had all sorts of freaky shit. They'd all be settled into their cots and sleeping bags, talking, and the fire alarm would go off. Previous to this, there were no batteries in said alarm. It was also cut off from the building's power supply. The one door to the room from the hall would open and close on its own. After it had been firmly shut and locked. Don't forget the always pleasant feeling of angry, hostile presence watching you while you sleep. Yeah, that place was great. Last one I've got. This was a couple of days after the Static Kid incident. We were clearing the north end of Khatun, which was supposed to be the ISI, Iraqi State of Islam, stronghold for all of Baquba. The locals had told us about a prison house the ISI had used and vacated before we showed up. We moseyed on over to check it out. The first thing I felt when I walked into the place was just pure, unadulterated death. The ISI had left long before we got there. There were no obvious bloodstains anywhere. They'd tried to burn any papers or computer hardware that showed what they did there. We still found things linking people and caught the fuckers. But this place just reeked of bad juju. Like you could feel the Reaper himself sitting in what used to be the living room drinking chai. It was easy to see how the place had been a prison, execution house. Doors had been modified or straight up replaced, so they would only open to a key from the outside. No furniture except a couple of worn tables. Random implements of torture hidden around the house. Large and small knives, hand drills, lengths of chain, a bullwhip, etc. There wasn't a whole lot of blood, but what cooking or outdoor project requires 10 butcher knives, a cleaver, 4 paring knives, and 3 hand drills? That place was just fucking evil.
My mom once told me that when she was living with my brother's dad, she's had 2 husbands, both are big losers, so they divorced. About 24 years ago, Mom and him, I'll call him Dave, were at home on their farm at night while the kids were asleep. My siblings are like 25-26, so they were just babies at the time. Mom looked out the window one evening toward her backyard neighbor's farm and saw a very bright light out in the crop field, about half a kilometer away. She had no idea what it was, and figured it was the neighbor out shining a light or something. She was confused, like, who would do that? Especially with such a bright light. She says it was brighter than a regular flashlight, like a searchlight. She figured it might have been a hunter or something trying to stun an animal. Her theories were all kind of random, but faced with the unexplained, the brain tries to come up with logical explanations. She ignored it. Every time she passed by the window again, there it was. About a half hour to an hour later, she noticed that the light was elevated a bit. She figured maybe it was someone with a light on a pole or on the top of a truck. Another while later, she sees it up at tree level. She at that point figured there was no way those theories could be true. Very confused now, she talked to Dave and explained what happened. He was just as confused and curious. Just as they were about to leave to go investigate, they saw it start moving very slowly. The only explanation at this point was that maybe it was a helicopter. It was silent though, so that's not possible. It remained around treetop level, and kept steadily going along the countryside. They tried to get to it by driving along the roads that went somewhat close to the light, but the roads didn't go through the farms, and the light was going through farmland and forests, so they just gave up and went home. She described it as just a plain strong light, not resting on a vehicle or flying saucer. She says it moved in a weird way through the sky, like nothing else possibly could. They didn't check the next day to go out and see if it made any tracks or whatever or left anything behind. I thought it was really interesting when I first heard the story and wondered why she hadn't told me before. To think that my mom witnessed something like that was a weird thought.
We had a storage closet under our stairs when I was a kid. The door was only half the height of regular doors and the ceiling sloped, and because of this it seemed special to me, somehow magical. When we moved in, I immediately claimed it as my own, and the first chance I got I invited a friend to sleep over, using the closet as a way to camp out. We told scary stories to each other and played the usual sleepover games. Eventually I had to use the bathroom, and because we had freaked each other out, and we were little girls, we went together. Just as I finished, we started to hear a creepy, broken-sounding song. After a couple of eye-watering seconds of terror, I recognized the sound of my little electronic piano. Thinking that it must be malfunctioning or needed new batteries, I was relieved. My friend was still freaked, so I went first into the dark living room. The door to the closet was open, even though I knew I had shut it completely before we went to the bathroom. The hinges were loose, so I had to lift the door to close it. I started to get nervous at this point. When I opened up the closet door, I noticed that the air inside was very hot and oppressive. I found this strange because it was fall and the temp in the rest of the house was pretty cool. The stuffiness of the closet was weird because we'd had the door open for hours while we played and talked. Right before I could pull the cord for the light, the piano started playing again. My friend latched onto my back with a death grip and I could feel her shaking. I told her it was nothing, just a toy with low battery power, and I turned on the light. Once I did, I could tell the music coming from the piano wasn't because of faulty batteries. The keys were moving up and down on their own. This toy couldn't do that unless someone was pressing the keys, physically. Clearly, I was frightened. Even so, I've always been the type of person to protect others and put their safety first, so on instinct I grabbed the piano, ran to our front door and threw it as hard as I could. I have no idea where it landed because I was already closing the door and running back to my friend. I was shaking so hard I felt like I might collapse. It's hard to believe, but children are very resilient, and my friend and I went back into the closet to continue our sleepover. We were talking about what had happened and trying to figure it out when I noticed the air change again, this time getting very cold. This could have been because it was getting later, of course, but what happened next makes me wonder. Earlier in the day we had been coloring and we had tacked a bunch of the pictures onto the walls of the closet. One of those pictures was lifting off the wall, slowly, from the bottom. I went quiet from shock, and when my friend looked to see what had scared me, all the color went out of her face and her pupils got huge. This made me realize that I wasn't seeing things, and I snapped my attention back to the picture. By this time the paper was nearly horizontal, only being held to the wall by the tack. Then, the tack started to move. It twisted itself out of the wall and fell onto the carpet. The picture was still hanging straight out from the wall. My friend and I ran as fast as we could to my parents' room and slept on the floor the rest of the night. My life has been filled with experiences like this. At this point the strange seems pretty normal, but when I was a kid I had no idea what was going on, and the unknown is terrifying.
You said your life is filled with experiences like that. Any other good ones you care to share?
The first clear memory I have of a strange event is when I was about 5 or 6 years old. My parents and I lived in my grandparents' attic at the time. I didn't have a room, exactly. It was more like an alcove with my bed and a side table with a small lamp on it. The only thing separating my room from the rest of the attic was a sheet that my parents had hung up. The attic was an extremely spooky place at night. We lived out in the middle of nowhere, so the silence was very deep, and it was startling when it was broken by the house settling or one of the dogs barking, etc. One night I was having trouble sleeping. I just wasn't tired, but I knew I would be in trouble if I got out of bed. So, I laid there, looking around at my room, wishing I could get up and play. Movement at the foot of the bed caught my eye. I saw something then that was one of the scariest things I've ever seen. It was a hand, reaching up from the end of my bed toward my feet. It was a very dark green color with long black talon-like nails. The skin was scaly, but was patchy and dry-looking. The fingers were skinny and too long. I can remember every detail. I still dream about it sometimes. I pulled my toes in quickly, and covered my head with my blanket. I could feel the hand's movements tugging at the blanket as it felt around for me. I assumed that's what it was doing. I really don't know. I was crying quietly by this time. I felt like I couldn't breathe enough to scream. When I felt the hand getting very close to my feet, I finally found my voice and shrieked for my mom. My mom is a sound sleeper and always was. It took a couple of minutes for her to reach me. I screamed the entire time. I really thought I was going to be taken by this thing before she could rescue me. She eventually burst through the sheet and scooped me up. She didn't see anything at the foot of my bed apparently. I have adrenaline rushing through me right now just remembering this event. I'll never forget what it felt like when that hand was reaching for me. I've posted a few of the strange things that have happened to me, but I haven't posted this one because I didn't think it would make a very scary read. Since this story is relevant to this thread, I'll go ahead. When I was just turning 15, my grandmother gave me a talking doll for my birthday. Why she thought a 15-year-old girl would want a doll, I don't know. Anyway, the first thing I did after she went home was to take the batteries out and stick the pink monstrosity in my closet. Later that night, heard a voice saying, "Play with me." My whole body started tingling with adrenaline and I dropped the book I had been reading. I finally recognized that the sound was that doll repeating one of the phrases it was programmed with, and I relaxed a little. It was still creepy, but I could get out of bed to go turn it off. I had completely forgotten about removing its batteries earlier. I slid my closet door open and saw the doll doing its thing, turning its head back and forth and talking in that fake little girl voice. I picked it up, flipped it over and pulled the Velcro tabs apart. I was just taking the cover off of the battery compartment when the doll whispered my name. I dropped that thing like it was on fire and ran down the stairs as fast as I could. I couldn't even go back up to my room to sleep that night. I was so afraid of that doll. I slept on the couch instead. The next day I decided I had to face this. I couldn't live on the couch and I had experienced so many other strange events. I figured I could handle a doll that knew my name, at least in the daytime. I thought I'd just go up there, pick it up and take it out to the trash. I went upstairs and the doll was laying right where I had left it, on its stomach with the little plastic battery cover sitting next to it. I could easily see from the doorway that there were no batteries in the compartment. I was very scared. I kept trying to psych myself up, but I was letting the anticipation of something happening get to me. Finally, I took one step into the room. As soon as I did this, the doll turned its head towards me and started speaking. I didn't stay long enough for what it said to register. Later that day I told my mother what had happened, and she went to check it out. According to her, the doll didn't move or speak, and she took it into her room to put away. I asked her why she didn't get rid of it, and she told me that it would hurt my grandmother's feelings if she didn't see it when she came over. She said that we could keep it in her room until Grandma came to visit, and I only had to be in its presence then. I was pretty upset, but I don't think my mom believed what I told her. She was a very strict Christian at the time, and I don't think she wanted to believe things like that could happen. From time to time that doll would still talk when its batteries were removed. I actually got used to it and started using it to scare my friends. I noticed that it would only behave in a paranormal way at my house, never at anyone else's. Eventually the doll disappeared, just like a lot of things do in my house, but it never reappeared like everything else. That was the only experience I've ever had with a haunted toy. The doll never showed up again. I currently live in the same house. My mother can't afford to stay here without financial help, and since I have a son with autism, it's nice to have her around to give me a break once in a while. Before my son was born, we completely cleaned out the house. We wanted to be sure the place was child-proof, and that was the best way. And I didn't see it anywhere, and according to the rest of my family, neither did they. Yes, I asked them. That doll was very creepy, and I didn't want it around for my son to find. As far as my friends were concerned, I told one of them what had happened with the doll, and she begged me to let her see it. She also told a bunch of our mutual friends all about it without even asking me if it was okay, but that's a completely different story. She wasn't the most trustworthy friend, you know how it goes. I reluctantly agreed and showed her the doll. I really didn't want to touch it for long, so I kind of threw it on the bed. My friend, I'll call her Jen, sat down and examined the doll. Jen made sure there were no batteries in it and then started talking to it. At first there was no response, and Jen got mad at me, thinking I had made it up to scare her. She tossed the doll back on the bed and said something to the effect of, "Stupid thing isn't scary anyway." And the doll turned its head towards her. Needless to say, she freaked out. At the time I was kind of angry at her for not believing me, and the way she shrieked and ran was entertaining enough to make the experience less frightening. So Jen of course told everyone we knew, and suddenly I was very popular. They all wanted to see this doll. After showing a couple more friends, I started to feel less frightened of it. I think because the longer I spent with it, the less strange it seemed. Although now I wonder how I could have gotten so comfortable with it. The doll didn't always perform on cue, of course, but I found that when my friends would mistreat the doll or me, getting angry at me for hoaxing them, etc., it would start to move or talk. I tried on a few occasions to take it over to people's houses so I could show them that I didn't have a tape recorder running or strings set up to move the doll or something. Unfortunately, that backfired on me because the doll did nothing outside of my home. I still don't know why. This is the start of an attempt to get down some of the more recent occurrences that I saved to finish and never did. I'm not sure where to start. The paranormal has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. Something that has happened in the last year or two is seeing what I assume is my brother's doppelganger, but it could also be a manifestation of the poltergeist that seems to come by randomly. But that's a whole different story. Anyway, the first time this happened, I was playing a game online and happened to notice my brother walk in the front door. I nodded to him like usual, and he just glared at me like I had called him a shithead or something, and he goes up to his room. My brother can be moody at times, so I just frowned and went back to what I was doing. Maybe 2 minutes later my brother walks in the front door. Huh? Hey, didn't I just see you go upstairs? I ask. He looks at me funny and kind of laughs. He says he's been outside since right after he woke up and hasn't been in till now. He seems to be in a really good mood, the opposite of the demeanor I noticed the entity display. This sort of thing started happening fairly regularly, so regularly that I make a point of making sure he says hi or something every time I see him, because as far as I can tell the entity can't or won't talk to me. All it ever does is glare at me like it wants to kill me. I'm sorry I didn't make it clear that had happened before the doll got lost.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.